At 68, I never thought my own son would drive away and leave me standing on the side of the road like a stranger. My name is Evelyn Hart. I spent more than 40 years teaching literature at a small high school just outside Portland, Oregon. I've lived long enough to see generations of students grow up, move away, and send postcards from places I'll never visit. I buried my husband 5 years ago. Since then, I've tried to live quietly, keeping my dignity and independence intact. My son, Michael, means well, or at least that's what he tells himself. He's successful, busy, and convinced that he knows what's best for everyone, including me. For months, he's been trying to convince me to move into a senior living community. "It's safe, Mom," he said. "There's staff, medical help, activities, you'll never be alone." But safety isn't the same as freedom. I told him that politely at first, then firmly. I like my little apartment. I like my books, my plants, my morning walks. Most of all, I like knowing that when I make a cup of tea, it's because I decided to, not because someone scheduled it for me. Still, that morning I got into his car and went with him to see the place. Maybe I wanted to prove something. Maybe I wanted to remind him that I was still capable of making choices. The tour was polite but sterile, smiling staff, beige walls, the faint smell of disinfectant. On the drive home, tension sat between us like a third passenger. He called it concern. I called it control. By the time we reached the outskirts of town, the argument that would change everything was already building. It started with a sigh, the kind that says more than words ever could. Michael gripped the steering wheel tighter, his jaw set, his patience wearing thin. "Mom, you're being unreasonable," he said, the way a manager might talk to an employee refusing to follow orders. "I'm not unreasonable," I replied, keeping my voice calm though my hands trembled slightly in my lap. "I just don't want to live somewhere that smells like antiseptic and loneliness." He laughed under his breath, a sound that stung. "You're romanticizing things again. You think it's all about independence, but you're not 25 anymore. What happens if you fall? What happens if no one's there?" I turned to the window, watching the gray sky blur past. "Then I get back up," I said quietly. "Like I always have." That was the breaking point. He slammed the brakes harder than necessary, pulling the car onto the shoulder of the road near a small bus stop. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me with something between frustration and fear. "Fine," he said. "If you're so independent, find your own way home. Maybe that'll help you realize you can't do everything alone." Before I could respond, he put the car in gear and drove away. The sound of his tires on the pavement faded, leaving only the hum of the wind and the faint chirp of birds somewhere in the distance. I stood there, stunned. My purse, my wallet, keys, bus pass was still sitting on the kitchen counter at home. My phone battery blinked red at 3%. 68 years old, stranded at a bus stop on a quiet road, my own son driving away in anger. I sank onto the metal bench, its surface burning hot from the afternoon sun. Cars passed occasionally, their drivers not giving me a second glance. It wasn't the heat that made my throat tighten, it was the humiliation. After decades of teaching, of raising a child, of surviving the loss of a husband, this was how my story looked now, a woman too old to fight, too proud to cry, and too tired to move. But life has a strange way of turning pain into a beginning. I just didn't know it yet. The bus stop was quiet except for the hum of traffic in the distance. I was lost in thought, trying to decide whether to walk or wait, when a gentle male voice interrupted the silence. "Excuse me," it said, calm and measured. I couldn't help overhearing. "You sound like someone who's been left behind." I turned. Sitting a few feet away was a man in his early 70s. His hair was perfectly silver, his suit a pale gray that seemed almost too elegant for a summer afternoon. A white cane rested against his leg and dark glasses shielded his eyes. "I'm fine," I said quickly, embarrassed, "just waiting for the next bus." He tilted his head slightly. "You don't sound fine." There was no pity in his tone, only quiet observation. "Your son left you, didn't he?" The words hit harder than I expected. "He'll come back," I murmured, more to convince myself than him. The man smiled faintly. "I doubt it. Sons rarely turn around that quickly after pride gets involved." He adjusted his posture with practiced ease. "My name is Henry Walker, and I have a proposition, Mrs. Hart," I said. "Evelyn Hart." "Well, Mrs. Hart, my driver will be arriving any minute. I'd like you to do me a small favor." "A favor?" I asked cautiously. "Pretend you're my wife," he said matter-of-factly. He'll assume I've picked you up after an errand. That way you'll have a safe ride home and your son will regret leaving you." I blinked. Surely I'd misheard. I can't possibly accept that. "You can," he replied gently. "Think of it as charity for an old blind man. You'd be saving me the trouble of worrying my driver about an empty seat." His humor caught me off guard, and against my better judgment, I laughed. "You don't give a person much room to refuse, Mr. Walker." "Henry," he corrected. "And no, I don't. Life's too short for excessive politeness." Before I could argue further, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A driver in a dark uniform stepped out, greeted Henry with a nod, and opened the rear door. "James," Henry said, his hand finding the cane with remarkable precision, "will be giving Miss Hart a ride today." The driver didn't question it. "Of course, sir." As Henry rose, his hand extended toward me. "Shall we?" I hesitated for only a moment before taking it. The warmth of his palm was steady and sure, not fragile as I'd expected. Inside the car, the air was cool and smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Henry sat beside me, relaxed, composed. "Now," he said, "where are we taking you, Mrs. Hart?" I gave him my address, still uncertain if I'd lost my mind or stumbled into the strangest act of kindness I'd ever known. He smiled as the car began to move. "Good. But first I insist we stop for tea. You've had a trying day, and I find tea solves nearly everything." And just like that, my life, ordinary, predictable, quietly fading, shifted course in the most unexpected way. The car glided through winding streets lined with towering oaks, leaving behind the modest neighborhoods I was used to. As we turned past an ornate iron gate, I caught my breath. Ahead stood a colonial-style mansion, white pillars, sweeping lawns, and windows that shimmered in the sunlight like glass eyes watching our arrival. "Welcome to my humble home," Henry said lightly. "Though, I suppose it's rather large for one man and a few staff members." I didn't know how to respond. I'd expected perhaps a nice house, not something that looked like it belonged in a movie. The driver parked, stepped out, and opened my door with professional ease. Inside, the air was cool and scented faintly with lemon and old books. Sunlight poured through tall windows, glinting off polished wood floors. A grand staircase curved upward in a perfect arc. But what struck me most was how normal everything seemed. No special railings, no textured floors, nothing that suggested a blind man lived here. "Please follow me," Henry said, tapping his cane lightly. He moved with surprising confidence, as if the space had memorized him as much as he'd memorized it. "We'll have tea in the garden room. I promise it's worth seeing, or so I'm told." The garden room turned out to be a glass conservatory filled with sunlight and the scent of blooming jasmine. Outside, rows of roses stretched toward a distant fountain. "Sit anywhere you like," Henry offered. "Comfort is more important than formality." When the tea arrived, silver tray, porcelain cups, lemon biscuits perfectly arranged, it felt almost ceremonial. Henry poured with such precision that I forgot for a moment he couldn't see. "You move around here awfully well for someone who's blind," I said, immediately regretting the bluntness. He smiled. 15 years of practice, I lost my sight gradually. The house was already part of my muscle memory. There was something so calm, so deliberate in his voice that it soothed the awkwardness between us. We spoke for a long time about aging, about independence, about the stubbornness of children who think love means control. "My daughter Clara," he said, "still insists on managing my life like a corporate project. I let her, to an extent. It's easier than arguing." I nodded. "My son's the same. Concern disguises itself as authority." Henry chuckled softly. "Ah, so we're both victims of love disguised as supervision." The conversation flowed naturally, unguarded, two people discovering that loneliness recognizes its own kind. When it was time to leave, I felt an unexpected reluctance. "Thank you," I said as James escorted me back to the car. "No," Henry replied, lifting his chin slightly toward my voice. "Thank you, Miss Hart, for restoring a bit of warmth to an otherwise dull afternoon." As the car pulled away, I looked back at the mansion disappearing through the trees, wondering why a stranger's kindness had touched me so deeply, and why I already suspected there was more to Henry Walker than met the eye. The days that followed blurred into quiet routine, watering my plants, reading, pretending life had returned to normal. But my thoughts kept circling back to Henry Walker, and that house that seemed too perfectly composed, too deliberate. He called 2 days later, his voice smooth and steady. "Mrs. Hart, I hope you've recovered from your ordeal. Would you consider joining me at the Wilson Foundation Gala this weekend? It's rather dull without interesting company." I hesitated. I hadn't attended a formal event in years, but there was something in his tone and easy confidence that made refusal difficult. "All right," I said, "as long as I don't have to pretend to be your wife again." He laughed softly. "No pretending this time. Just conversation and perhaps a dance, if you're willing to guide a blind man." That Saturday evening, a car arrived precisely on time. The driver, James, handed me an elegant envelope and invitation embossed with gold. The address led to a downtown art museum transformed by soft lights and music. Inside, Henry stood among a cluster of guests, dressed in a black tuxedo, cane in hand, dark glasses in place. He looked commanding. Every movement was measured, graceful, yet as I watched him turn toward people seconds before they spoke, a small shiver ran through me. Later, as we sat together, I decided to test a theory. "Your tie is navy blue," I said casually, though I hadn't mentioned it aloud before. Without missing a beat, Henry smiled. "You have an eye for detail." A harmless coincidence, maybe, but then I adjusted my earring sapphires that caught the light and said, "Do you like them?" He turned his head slightly, eyes hidden behind glass, and said, "They suit you, simple but strong. Just like you." I froze. He couldn't have known their color. He couldn't even have known I was touching them. When the orchestra began playing, he rose easily, extending his hand. "Dance with me?" I took it, studying him as we moved. His steps were flawless, his turns perfectly timed. Blind men don't waltz like that. Something wasn't right. By the end of the night, I knew with absolute certainty Henry Walker, the charming man who claimed to live in darkness, could see perfectly well. I couldn't shake the thought as we moved across the gleaming marble floor, his hand steady against mine, his steps too confident for a man deprived of sight. Every turn, every subtle change in rhythm, he anticipated them before the music shifted, before I even guided him. When the song ended, he smiled as though nothing in the world were amiss. "You dance beautifully," he said. "So do you," I replied, my voice calm though my heart beat fast. "Remarkably so." He tilted his head slightly, that practiced gesture I was beginning to recognize as part of his performance. Years of learning to move by instinct. "Instinct," I echoed, letting the word hang between us. Before he could answer, a tall woman in a crimson gown approached. "Mr. Walker," she said warmly, "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "This is Evelyn Hart," he said smoothly, turning precisely toward her voice, "a dear friend." "Lovely to meet you," the woman said, her handshake firm and appraising. "I'm Margaret, a member of the foundation board. It's refreshing to see Henry out in public again." "Don't let him fool you," I said lightly. "He manages quite well." Margaret smiled and moved on, but Henry's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "You have a mischievous streak, Miss Hart." "Maybe," I said, meeting the dark lenses of his glasses. "Or maybe I just noticed things." Later that night, as the event wound down, he leaned toward me. "Would you join me in the sculpture garden? It's quieter there." The garden was softly lit by lanterns and moonlight, the sound of water trickling from a fountain nearby. We walked slowly until he stopped beneath a canopy of ivy. "You've been watching me," he said quietly, no trace of playfulness now. "I have," I admitted, "and I know you're not blind, Henry." For a long moment there was silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, he removed his dark glasses. His eyes, clear, blue, unclouded, met mine directly. "You're right," he said simply. "But before you judge me, you deserve to know why." The confession didn't sound like guilt, it sounded like relief. And as I stood there beneath the silver light of the garden, I realized that whatever this truth was, it was about to change both of our lives forever. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint rush of the fountain, a soft rhythm marking the quiet between us. Henry set his glasses on the stone ledge and took a slow breath. 15 years ago, he began, I was the CEO of a cybersecurity company. We were small at first, then exploded overnight. Success brought attention, and attention brought danger. He paused, glancing toward the trees as if searching for something just beyond sight. We developed software meant to protect people's identities, but someone wanted it for control instead. When threats came, calls, letters, even break-ins, I made the decision to disappear. Not physically, but publicly. I let the world think I'd lost my sight. It gave me space to work, to live quietly, to protect my daughter. Clara? I asked softly. He nodded. She was 16 then. I told her the truth, and she kept the secret. Only she and my driver, James, have ever known. I struggled to take it in. The charm, the precision, the carefully built persona all made sense now. Yet something inside me ached for him. You've lived like this for 15 years? Yes, he said. At first, it was a shield. Then it became a prison. I thought if people pitied me, they'd leave me alone. But it also meant no one saw me anymore? Not really. His voice softened. Until you. I felt my chest tighten. Me? He smiled faintly. You didn't treat me like a fragile thing. You challenged me. You noticed the lies I built. It's strange, isn't it? The moment someone truly sees you is both terrifying and freeing. We stood there for a long moment, the air thick with unspoken emotion. Finally, I said, you could have told me sooner. I know, he admitted, but I wasn't ready to be seen again. There was vulnerability in his honesty that disarmed me. This wasn't a conman, it was a man who'd hidden too long behind his own fear. When he took my hand, his touch was steady, grounded. Evelyn, I don't expect forgiveness, but thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be real. And for the first time that night, I realized the truth I hadn't wanted to admit. I cared about him more than I should have. The weeks that followed blurred into something both tender and uncertain. Henry and I saw each other often, afternoon walks through the garden, quiet dinners by candlelight, conversations that stretched deep into the night. He was still cautious, careful about who knew of his regained sight, but around me, he dropped the act entirely. I grew used to the way his eyes followed me now, alive with warmth and curiosity. It was strange how quickly trust could grow between two people who met by accident. One evening, as we sat on the terrace watching the sunset bleed into the sky, he said softly, "You've changed my world, Evelyn. For years I hid behind blindness to avoid being hurt, but now I can't imagine going back." I smiled. Maybe it's time you stop pretending for everyone, not just me. He looked out toward the horizon, thoughtful. Perhaps you're right, but truth, once spoken, has a price. That price came sooner than either of us expected. 2 weeks later, the morning paper carried a headline that made my stomach drop. Philanthropist Henry Walker exposed. The blind benefactor who can see. Someone had leaked the story. The article accused him of deception, manipulation, even using his false blindness to attract sympathy and donations. News outlets pounced on it, and within hours his name was everywhere. I found him in his study, staring at the folded newspaper on his desk. "It's all true," he said quietly. "Except for their motive, they think I did it for money or pity. But it was never about that." I sat across from him, my heart breaking at the exhaustion in his face. "Then tell them, Henry. Tell the truth before they twist it further." He looked up at me, eyes weary but clear. "And what if no one believes me?" "Then at least you'll have believed in yourself," I said. "You've hidden long enough." For a long time, he said nothing. Then he reached for my hand. "You make courage sound simple." "It isn't," I whispered, "but it's the only way forward." Outside, reporters were already gathering by the gate. The story was out. The world was waiting. And for the first time in 15 years, Henry Walker would have to face it with his eyes wide open. The press conference was scheduled for the following afternoon. By sunrise, reporters crowded the street outside his mansion, their voices a low murmur beneath the buzz of camera drones and microphones. Henry dressed with quiet precision, no dark glasses, no cane. The sight of him without those familiar props made my chest tighten. He looked taller somehow, unburdened. As we walked toward the podium set up in front of the fountain, he leaned toward me and whispered, "If I falter, stay close." "I'm not going anywhere," I said. When the cameras began flashing, he raised a hand for silence. His voice was steady, carrying easily through the courtyard. "For 15 years," he began, "I lived as a man I wasn't. I told the world I was blind, not to deceive but to survive. At the time, I believed disappearing was the only way to protect my family and my work, but over the years, the mask I wore stopped protecting me. It started to suffocate me." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The truth is, I was afraid of failure, of loss, of being seen too clearly. But fear isn't freedom. Hiding isn't healing." A ripple moved through the crowd, some murmurs of disapproval, others of understanding. Henry turned slightly toward me. Someone reminded me recently that honesty is the truest form of courage. She's standing right here. My throat tightened, but I managed a small smile. He continued, today, I'm asking for forgiveness not for losing my sight but for pretending to. And for anyone who's ever hidden out of fear, I hope my story reminds you there's still time to see the world again. When he stepped back from the microphone, the crowd erupted questions, flashes, applause. But Henry just exhaled a quiet, relieved sound. For the first time in years, he said softly, turning to me, I can see clearly. A year passed, the headlines faded, the scandal quieted, and Henry Walker rebuilt his life not as a myth, but as a man. The Wilson Foundation grew stronger than before, its mission redefined around transparency and truth. People no longer saw him as the blind benefactor, but as someone who had faced his past and refused to let it define his future. As for me, I moved back into my own rhythm, mornings with coffee and sunlight, afternoons spent reading by the window. But Henry was never far away. One spring morning he called and asked me to meet him somewhere important. When the car pulled up, I recognized the road instantly, the quiet stretch where my son had left me behind that terrible day. Henry was waiting by the old bus stop, dressed simply in a navy coat. In his hand was a small box. I thought it was time we came full circle, he said. I smiled, half teasing. You're not about to make a grand speech, are you? He chuckled. Just a promise. When he opened the box, I saw a sapphire ring, deep blue, the same color as the earrings he'd somehow noticed that night at the gala. Evelyn Hart, he said gently, you once reminded me that being seen is a gift. I see you, fully, clearly, and I don't ever want to look away. Tears filled my eyes before I could answer. You're a stubborn man, Henry Walker. He grinned. Takes one to know one. I slipped the ring on, and the world seemed to slow, the sun warm on my skin, the sound of distant traffic fading. Sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones who start as strangers. If this story touched your heart, share it. Tell someone you love that you see them, truly see them. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of courage, love, and second chances.